Now let's add a little light on the subject. Might be better stage lighting. And this is my COVID-19 novel I've titled Clark's Landing, a fictional resort town in Idaho, about 50 miles outside of Boise. And let's start here. All this time I could not escape the coronavirus pandemic, which has swallowed the world in chaos and fear. The train of death most easily seen in hospitals, the long passages at home with family, a stark change for everyone. The father out of work, the mother working from home, society tied into a very dangerous Gordian knot. And this was happening to all of us. Nearly every state except Florida and Texas has a stay-in-place order issued by the governor. How many kids on spring break flock to the Florida beaches? The go-it-alone state rights foremost Republicans may be singing a different tune in the future. Perhaps people will need jobs after this medical emergency is over. Thoughts of triage are anathema, and the hospitals are ill-equipped to deal with an onslaught of COVID-19 patients who are dying from pulmonary failure, while respirators are few and far between. John Bolton abolished the department which would have responded to this emergency in a bid for short-sighted cost savings in 2018. The Trump administration is directly responsible for the severity of this epidemic. Were it summer, I would take a swim in the lake to cool off, but this is in late March at night. The most I would do is take out the canoe. I could cross the lake. In all this time I've lived here, I've not yet done this, cross the lake. The moonlight across the water was beautiful, and I unmoored the canoe and lowered myself into it from the dock edge. I picked a formation of treetops dimly visible and aimed for it as I paddled the canoe, and almost immediately I was sundered from care and concern, pulling the canoe forward through the water. Tomorrow will sort itself out. Another permutation of events, another collection of daily occurrences out of Washington, D.C. and around the country, another set of prominent figures and their remarks. In less than 10 minutes of relaxed gliding in the canoe, my arms beginning to burn, I discovered a dock, where I moored the canoe and walked toward a summer home with its windows lit. I went around to the front of the house, where I saw a woman come out to the front porch with a 6-volt flashlight. "What do you want, mister, sneaking around in the dark?" "I'm your neighbor from across the lake, Paul Richmond. Suddenly I felt cooped up, so I got in my canoe and figured I'd cross the lake. I don't know why. It was an impulse, like coming here." "Do you always act on your impulses, Mr. Richmond?" she said. "By the way, my name's Jane Crestfield." "Well, I'm happy to meet you, Miss Crestfield. I'll be getting back to the lake now," I said and turned to go. "No, wait. Why don't you come inside and we can sit and visit a while? I've been cooped up here myself." "Sure," I said. After looking at her for a moment, I couldn't see her very well because she was still shining that light in my face. She smiled and turned back toward the door, and I followed her into the house. Well, this sounds promising. Paul Richmond is the narrator of this novel, a retired mathematics professor from Idaho State University. And he even has a pipe, as sometimes professors do, and often they have done in the past, particularly back in the 50s, when Most men wore hats still. So where were we? Oh. Well, let's see. And she says, I'm alone here with my dog, who is presently shut away in the storage room where he sleeps. Do you live out here year-round? You must be retired then. I followed her into the kitchen. Would you like a glass of wine, Mr. Richmond? All right. You aren't much of a talker, are you? I'll try to loosen up. You've got quite a place here. It's my weekend retreat. I just love it. Say, you've done all right for yourself. What do you do for a living, if I may be so bold? You may. She said, I'm a real estate broker in Boise, one of the better ones. I don't mind saying. This woman had dark brown hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was wearing black framed glasses, which she soon removed and lay aside. What do you do, Mr. Richmond? How do you fill your day now that you're retired? I'm an ardent Sanders supporter. I said I spend a few hours each day working on Green New Deal angles. And what do you do when you come up with one of these angles, she asked. I catalog it, I said. I was a mathematics professor before I retired. I shouldn't pretend any longer, Mr. Richmond. I know who you are. When I bought the place, I asked the realtor about the owner on the other side of the lake, and this man said, Old man Richmond lives there, he said. This old guy has a curious reputation. He seems like he's always just emerging from a state in which he was dazed and confused. Well, there's more to it, I said. The high school kids think you're kick-ass, and now you've been assaulted. Wait, how'd you find out about that? The police log in the newspaper, she said. I didn't know there was a local paper. Well, you're out of touch, Paul. You're far less anonymous than you think. People always talk, you know. I know quite a bit about you for someone who evidently thinks he's still anonymous. I don't believe that anymore, I said. I understand, word gets around. For example, I know you recently had an affair with Rachel James. We went out a couple of times, that was it. You invited them to your house for dinner. How the hell would you know a thing like that, I said, irritated, offended. My sources for gossip are varied and rich, she said. Yes, I'm beginning to see that. Well, she was a bit young for you, don't you think? Jane, I said, you've got me there. She may have found me none too passionate. I'm sure you could do just fine with the right encouragement, she said. I set my glass of wine down and leaned in to kiss her, and she parted her lips and waited for me while I paused for a moment and said, This is an infraction against the public health decree of distancing. I don't care, she said. I'm sick of social distancing. 37. As you might have expected, I found myself in the woman's bed the following morning. The robins had just mounted their morning song fest, and I slipped out of bed in the gray light. It's been said before, though by whom I've no idea, you do not choose a way of life. The path of life you're on has long since already chosen you. The you alone, as a single identity, doesn't even exist. It is merely an abstraction of language. The air unifies us, as has the coronavirus. I walked down to the dock, pleased to think she might wake up with a smile on her face. Earlier in the evening, she had given me one of her business cards. I paddled back across to my side of the lake, transformed into a man with a woman, in all likelihood. She is wonderfully seductive. She purrs when she makes a suggestion. When I had regained my breath, she had asked, You're not tired yet, are you? I was hoping we could chat for a while. Of course, I said, my beard thick with the scent of her pussy. I scooted up to a sitting position as she did, her breast fully exposed. I was looking into her eyes. They were green like mine, hazel, which apparently are changeable, since over the years I have heard that expressed by a few different women. They all seemed mildly surprised. Once I was told one of my eyes was green and the other blue. Look, Jane, there's no use in trying to conceal my problem. Well, my impulsivity, for one thing. A civilized person has to follow certain rules. Yes, the social contract. Some man once told me it was Rousseau's idea. Why would he say something like that if it wasn't true? Most professional talk off the cuff, were recorded and transcribed, would prove to be common fodder, I said. Their remarks are all variations on themes mounted long ago. Reactionaries like Hannity and Limbaugh have been whistling the same tune for years. Their ideologues have pandered to the anti-intellectuals. Someone told me you're a socialist. That's true, just like Jack London, I said. I gazed into her eyes, these wondrously expressive, attentive, and worldly beautiful eyes, and said, "You're a Republican, most likely." Well, don't hold it against me. Political disputes won't get between us, but we can talk about what appears good, or appears useful, or appears just. I'm glad you rode across the lake and then came to visit me. I came here in a canoe just like Lewis and Clark. You have to paddle on one side and then the other. For limited durations, it can be good exercise. You're in great shape for a guy your age, Paul. Thanks, sweetheart. I attribute my fitness to the bicycle. The Chinese were exceptionally fit, but now they have cars and they're getting soft, just like Americans. We're not soft. Of course we are, Jane. Look at the obesity rate. 1/3 of children are obese. It's out of control. The kids who don't like sports are the ones who get fat, she said. Back in the 50s and 60s, you would not have found vending machines in school hallways offering up candy and sodas, I said. And kids aren't allowed to go anywhere by themselves nowadays. They walk and run much less than they used to. You have kids? 2 daughters. They're jewels. She said, "Do you have kids?" "A son and a daughter," I said. They're both married. They each have kids. Young families. My girls are still in college, although they're both at my place now, even though one has her own apartment. She didn't want to be alone during all this. Her roommate had gone home to her parents, so the girls are both at home, and I'm stuck out here after a weekend visit. It's crazy. And now you! We kept talking for what must have been well over 2 hours. When both of us had dozed off, the lamp on her side of the bed still on and too far away for me to shut off without getting out of bed, so I lay alongside her and listened to her breathe until the robins began to sing. I had stumbled into a wonderful situation during the world's second overpowering pandemic, which has brought capitalism to its knees. I tied off the boat and walked up to my cabin. I put a kettle of water on the stove and set out a cup with a tea bag in it. The robins were still singing. I opened the kitchen window to hear them. I hadn't felt this good in a long time, having submitted to the greatest natural force there is, sexual attraction. As soon as the shelter-in-place order was lifted, Jane would go back to Boise. She still has to earn a living, though I couldn't see many people buying homes in the near future. By now, the stock market has dropped by 1/3. Many businesses have closed, many factories have been shuttered, but the economy won't simply restart like a failed engine. Like everyone else, I would slowly discover what the protective measures against COVID-19 and the coronavirus have taken from us. The lost jobs, the evictions, the lost homes. I think if I were in my 30s now, I would be paralyzed with anxiety. The university closed, the students departed, the town completely shut down. I would have nowhere to go except for the mountains, yet going out alone to the mountains would somehow be unseemly. A decent, upright man would never leave his family's side during this crisis, this strange crisis which brings to mind the aftermath of Mount St. Helens eruption. Gray ash covered the ground everywhere. This ultrafine silica dust which covered the lawns, the streets, the bushes, the trees. Few people were walking about. Many who did wore masks. Few cars or trucks were out on the streets. A calm spring day, and the town appeared at first glance to have been deserted. This period lasted only a week, but it gave everyone an unnerving sense of helplessness. We were hundreds of miles away from Mount St. Helens, but we had to deal with the ash. I was 27 then, a recent recipient of a PhD from WSU in mathematics. My dissertation had been in defense of a recent advance by a mathematician from the Czech Republic who had stirred some controversy when he attended a world chess tournament and predicted the top 10 finishers and ranked them correctly, save for an inversion of the 7th and 8th place players. He did all this based on a computer analysis of the first 20 moves of each entrant. This astonishing feat was based on a proprietary algorithm he had devised, the culmination of several years of work, which my thesis encapsulated and presented, along with the suggestion for future work, which I later took up after the kids and Karen and I were settled in Pocatello, where I had been offered a place to teach at the university there. A good place for our children to grow up, enjoying the freedom and security of small-town life. I was tempted to turn on the radio and listen to NPR's coverage of the coronavirus pandemic, though such news, which at turns can be both frightening and exasperating, can also leave me with a sense of fatigue and gloom. The weather has grown blustery since early this morning. I remember when the forest fires outside Pocatello filled the skies with smoke for days, and the low-flying bombers loaded with fire retardant passed back and forth over the town between fire and airport, where they picked up more fire retardant trucked in by the Forest Service. Sam Richards and I were walking toward the tavern across Fifth Avenue from the university. Richards was particularly troubled over the fire. He talked at length about the forced migration of animals with a fire at their heels. The burrowing rodents have no trouble surviving unless they're asphyxiated, he said. But the grazing animals and their predators simply have to run. They run downwind away from the fire's advance. Their flight from the smoke and heat is a reaction, not a decision, even though some of them have seen fire before, fire caused by a lightning strike. I should try to find his address, write a letter to him, see how he's doing. He'd write back to me. Sam's more of a Luddite than I am. I knew he had moved to Bellingham after the sudden death of his parents, who were slammed into by a drunk driver. I switched on my phone and used Google to search for Sam Richards in Bellingham. The internet has driven more than a few detective agencies out of business. His name appeared in a directory of county employees. He was with the Whatcom County Environmental Protection Division. His telephone number was listed for him. I could write to him in care of the county agency, but I decided to try the number, hoping it might be his own cell phone. But it was only the recorded voice of the department secretary, who explained the office was closed due to the shelter-in-place order issued by Governor Jay Inslee. After sitting down at my desk in my study, I opened the bottom drawer and took out a legal-sized envelope, and from another drawer I took out a sheet of stamps commemorating America's tradition of the county fair. Once I'd addressed the envelope and affixed a stamp to the upper right-hand corner, I took a sheet from a nearby ream of 25% rag and set about writing a letter to my old friend. Sam, it's been several years now. I used to enjoy our conversations, and I must say I learned a lot about biology from you. I remember when you were conducting your study of starling murmurations. You accomplished something no one had tried before with those micro GPS devices your team attached to the temporarily unconscious starlings. I always thought it was a fascinating experiment, although one impossible without a computer's infinite endurance for computation. I would hope you would learn some mathematics from me, even though some terms I may have used were only empty concepts to you without any affected, invoking the precise structures or set of conditions they referred to. During this initial and most awful phase of what I believe will become our next world, I have an easy time of it. I needn't set foot out of my cabin, a snug retirement home, for 2 weeks. Probably won't see a soul, but apparently you haven't retired yet. Well, what's it like for you there in Bellingham? Nice little town. Went there to attend a conference once. I still think your dismissal from the university was an outrage. The university officials have contingency plans for such things filed under when the boat has been rocked. The power of religion over people frustrates me, Sam, much the way it has surely frustrated you. But I am afraid it won't die out in any technical age. The culture of every country in the world has been suffused with religion until the 20th century, when the first successful break from the chains of the past took place in both Russia and China. Global commerce will set the course of history from now on, not religion. The Puritan work ethic is worldwide now, and capitalism compels many of us to become wage slaves. But wage earners are not cut off from each other, even though the unions are still shrinking and have been ever since the late 50s. They have the final distraction of social media to share concerns and grievances about working conditions or infrequent, minuscule raises. The pandemic will show people that we depend on government for services which the open market cannot provide. The most interesting question now, since the $2.2 trillion recovery package is now law, is how soon the money will be distributed. What percentage of the population will get a direct deposit? Wishing you the best, Paul. Wishing you the best, Paul. I didn't hold out much hope that working people would receive the relief money in time. Theoretically, anyone who has paid taxes or received a refund electronically will obtain this $1,200 the soonest. Next, those who don't have bank accounts, or if they do and they chose to receive their tax refund in the mail, they would get theirs in the mail in the next 10 days. Otherwise, Mr. and Ms. Out of Luck have to contact the government's new website within the IRS, thrown together to handle this situation, all too likely full of bugs. What I despise about Trump most of all is his erasure game. His upending or feigned ignorance of the facts is most despicable and nauseating and morally foul. This grand episode should have ripped off the most jaded of shutters, raised the heaviest of eyelids, and finally reduced Trump to the slithering fraud that he is. For the people who care nothing for politics and hate the federal government, I have this to say. The outlaws of the South who hate much of present-day American society, as well as to the drug dealer glorified in rap music, jump back into your pool of savagery and criminality. Remain down inside your odious cage. I see this present day in glimpses of horror and farce, reason and decay, art and business. The tyranny of media I apply to all broadcasts in any electronic form. First, we must all admit that we need competent government agencies, both state and federal, which can successfully communicate with one another. People can easily attack me and call me an armchair philosopher. I would be pleased with the title. The government agency most important to everyone is the school, and this is where we must all first begin. The lunacy of this new age is apparent when the Republicans and the capitalists banded together and brought Trump and his cronies to the national and world stage. The capitalists would never have allowed this bungling charade of government when every single Republican ideal has been sacrificed merely to avert government regulation. They were desperate. They understand that the capitalism of the Gilded Age is impossible now, but they still want to retain as much control over their production practices as possible. Most of us know nothing about any of this. but some of us sense a potential for the renewal of some values and the transformation of others. The former hatreds can be set aside, even prior sufferings. What is wrong with invoking religion when doing so splits people apart? This process has been fueling wars for thousands of years. Differences cannot be set aside, they must be overcome, as with any prejudice. Do you have pleasant interactions with your wife, or do you sink into some hobby, newfound perhaps, the space apart now mandatory 6 feet apart and required by a government-issued decree? The willful distancing often practiced by the introspective, the style of behavior must now be adopted by all. In this climate of avoidance and fear, we must still live every day the contagion foremost in everyone's mind. But the reflective can easily forget that active people like to hang out together. As a reflective man, I need to remind myself of this fact. There will be an unprecedented number of people online at the same time making their broadcast to friends, to strangers. This instant contact between a group of people is quite remarkable, though now it is commonplace. Let's call this augmented intelligence, this use of the internet, a tool of synthesis yet to be fully understood. How it has begun to restructure society, as it has done most visibly in politics and business. For a time, much seemed to be made of Barack Obama's BlackBerry cell phone. Well, that's enough of that. I'll just gab until the half hour's over. Well, well, I get wrapped up in my work, I suppose. Leading a life of the mind is not easy, and it has its pitfalls, believe me. And leading a life in the imagination, a region of the mind, is even more tricky. And in literature, there's no finer example than Cervantes' work, Don Quixote. You might say the duel between imagination and reality, or fantasy and reality. The duel, the constant duel. And of course his faithful sidekick, Sancho Panza, was the realist of the two, and watched out for him always, and cleaned up after him, you know. Poor old sod, half demented with all these tales of knight errantry that he had read and become consumed by. And of course,